Welcome to this week's history clip, part of our Hands-on History at Your House series. For the next few weeks, we will explore the history of the people of the Mahoning Valley with these short videos, online activities, and museum challenges. For more information, be sure to visit our website, mahoninghistory.org. This week is all about the first European settlers who came to this area about 220 years ago. Now, to learn about them, we need to go back to when European settlers first established permanent colonies in North America, or what they often called the New World. This was back in the early 1600s. That's more than 400 years ago. Eventually, 13 colonies emerged under British rule, and by the year 1700, there were about 250,000 European settlers and enslaved Africans living in those colonies. In the years leading up to the American Revolution, the 13 colonies slowly expanded towards the west. By the start of the Revolutionary War, those 13 now states were relatively the same shape that they are today, and nearly 2.5 million people lived in the new United States of America. After the war, the United States was a new country and growing in both land size and population. Many of the states had claims on Western land, but most of those states gave up that land so that new states could be formed. Connecticut was one of the last states to give up its land out here in what was called Ohio Country. They gave the land to the federal government to be part of the Northwest Territories, but they reserved some of it for their own state to use, and that land became known as the Connecticut Western Reserve. The land was split into two parts, with the western section known as the Firelands. This area was reserved for people who lost their homes and property from destruction in the Revolutionary War. The eastern part of the Western Reserve was sold to the Connecticut Land Company in 1795. Soon, investors and real estate businessmen came to the area to buy and sell land. One of those early settlers was John Young, a businessman from New York. He purchased an entire township from the Connecticut Land Company, about 15,000 acres, for just over $16,000, and that's about $350,000 in today's money. The area was known as Trumbull County, even though there's lots of other counties there today. And each township measured 5 miles by 5 miles and was numbered as ranges and townships. John Young's town, or what we call Youngstown, was Township 2, Range 2. And John Young designed the plan for his new town, and much of that plan remains in place today. Not the buildings, of course, but the road layout and even the width of those streets. So John Young was joined by several people, including Daniel Sheehy, Abraham and Isaac Powers, and James Hillman, who all helped him navigate the Mahoning River and find locations. What did they find when they got here? Well, they found a dense, thick forest along the shores of the Mahoning River, full of trees and, of course, small wild animals like deer and bears and wolves. And there was this Western fever rolling through the country, and many people in the East longed for that open land that was out here in what was really the Wild West. And yeah, in the 1790s and early 1800s, this was the Wild West frontier. Some of the first land in the area that John Young sold was to Catherine Hillman. That was James Hillman's wife. Young offered her 6 acres if she promised to bring her family to the new community. Daniel Sheehy then bought about 1,000 acres for his family, and his wife Jane, like most pioneer women, was resilient and strong. She helped her neighbors and made a lasting impact by raising a family here in the Mahoning Valley. And James Hillman was also instrumental in laying out the town with John Young, and he bought about 200 acres of land in addition to those acres that Catherine had. Hillman served as a sheriff, he volunteered during the War of 1812, and after the war, he sold his tavern business and bought a farm along Crab Creek. And around 1814, he was elected to the state legislature. During the War of 1812, James Hillman served with Colonel William Rayan, and he came here with his wife Margaret in 1802. They allowed their home to be used as a meeting place and helped to establish the early government here in Youngstown. William Rayan ran several businesses and was a big promoter of developing a canal in downtown Youngstown. The Pennsylvania and Ohio Canal opened in 1840 and transformed transportation for both goods and people and helped to establish Youngstown as a center of trade and commerce. Rayan's best-known legacy, though, is the establishment of Youngstown's first public school, the Rayan School. Other early residents included Margaret Van Horn Dwight and the Walcott family. What makes their story so special is that we know quite a bit about it. During her journey, Margaret kept a journal of everything that happened, and many years later, her journal was published as a book called Journey to Ohio in 1810. And this book tells the story that so many people had when they came out here to the Western Reserve, traveling in wagons on rough, bumpy roads, walking over mountain passes, and the hardship of that travel. If there were no bridges, rivers were crossed by ferry boats, and they traveled about 600 miles from Connecticut through New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and finally out here to the Western Reserve. And all of this meant that their progress was only about 10 miles a day. So what was life like when they finally got out here to the Western Reserve? Here's a story from Alexander McKinney about the clothes that they wore. And he writes, "Whatever we had to wear, we manufactured for ourselves. The men raised flax and the women spun and wove it. The wool was shorn from the sheep and picked and carted by hand." Now, most folks built simple log cabins as their first homes here. Those log cabins were easy to build, but after several years, many families were able to build and move into larger and nicer homes. The daily lives of children were probably spent doing household or farm chores, attending school, doing more chores after school, and then off to bed to start it all over again the next day. Of course, they had books and games, but school looked quite a bit different than it does today. The first school in Youngstown only had a few students, and schools in other townships were about the same size, many of them starting between 1800 and the year 1810. These small one-room schoolhouses remained the main source of education throughout much of the 1800s. Students read from books, did their work on slate boards, and likely only attended school for a handful of years before leaving school for work. Now, some students, of course, attended school longer, especially those who chose to be doctors, lawyers, teachers, or other professionals. Business in those early days also looked a bit different than it does today. Aside from dry goods stores or other shops, industry was based around the waterways, as folks harnessed the power of water to help run their mills. One of the first was built by Phineas Hill and Isaac Powers on Mill Creek, and it's right where Lanterman's Mill stands today. This was just one of many early mills, which paved the way for the iron industry and eventually the massive steel mills, which were this area's main source of jobs around the turn of the 20th century. But you're going to learn all about that next week as we talk about the growers, the people who helped grow this area into a huge, bustling center of business, industry, and commerce. So now that you've learned about the first settlers who lived right here in the Mahoning Valley, be sure to check out our website for your hands-on history at your house activities. Become a proud museum assistant by completing all of those activities, or learn even more and become a museum curator by researching one of these people, or maybe you'll find another early pioneer and learn a few more things about their daily lives. All of the challenge information can be found on our website, and be sure to share your creations online with the hashtag HistoryAtMyHouse2021. And we'll see you next week.